We're back once again in Richard Muller's Calvin and the Reformed Tradition on the Work of Christ and the Order of Salvation, and today we're in Chapter 5, Davenant and Du Moulin, Variant Approaches to Hypothetical Universalism. This is Chapter 5 of 8 chapters and then a conclusion, so we're roughly halfway through the text. We'll go through Chapter 5 section by section. The first is the introductions, problems with historiography and terminology. Muller opens the chapter by addressing serious historiographical failures in the study of Reformed views on the Atonement. He critiques scholars for conflating Christ's satisfaction for sin with the term atonement, calling this identification somewhat problematic. He also notes how much of the modern debate has been fraught with a series of difficulties ranging from narrow sampling of sources, failure to appreciate internal diversity, and imposition of modern biases. On page 162, he writes, quote, "Discussion of hypothetical universalism has typically focused on the issue of the relationship of Amyraldianism and Calvin's theology, and has accordingly run aground on the reef of the Calvinism question," unquote. So rather than falling into these kinds of binaries, for instance, Calvin versus the Calvinists, Muller seeks to showcase lesser-known, non-Amyraldian forms of hypothetical universalism within the confessional Reformed tradition. The next section is John Davenant and the Gallican controversy over hypothetical universalism. Davenant, Dort, and dating the debate. That is quite the alliteration. John Davenant, 1572 to 1641, was Bishop of Salisbury and the delegate to the Synod of Dort. Is often claimed, wrongly, Muller would argue, as proto-Amyraldian. Muller clarifies that Davenant represents a distinct non-Amyraldian form of hypothetical universalism. The key piece of evidence is Davenant's manuscript response to a Gallican theological query, likely composed between 1621 and 1625, which critiques the views of John Cameron and his supporter at Saumur. The Gallican concern equated the views of Cameron with the English and Bremen delegations at Dort, an association Davenant wanted to clarify. Muller writes on page 166, "The document begins with a statement of significant disagreements among the Reformed churches, noting that some claim Christ died for all individuals by a general intention of universal grace," unquote. Davenant critiques this as dangerously close to Arminianism unless very carefully qualified. Davenant, the British delegation, and the Synod of Dort. The British delegation was internally divided on the interpretation of Article 31 of the 39 Articles. Did Christ die for all particular men or only for the elect? Davenant and Samuel Ward, not as full impetration, but as a redimibilitas, which essentially means redeemability, and reconciliabilitas, or reconcilability, a possibility grounded in Christ's merit, but not efficaciously applied. The British collegiate suffrage tried to avoid controversial language. Muller writes on 171, quote, "They argued to omit the received distinction of sufficientia in efficacia mortis Christi, because the distinction is so general as not to resolve the issue," unquote. Still, Davenant affirmed a universal promise rooted in Christ's death, quote, "By this oblation once made, Christ did found, confirm, and ratify the eternal covenant, which may ought to be preached seriously to all mankind without exception," unquote. That was on page 172. Yet only the elect receive saving grace and faith, distinguishing impetration from application. Davenant's response to the Gallican controversy. Davenant parses the general intention language used by Cameron with great care. He distinguished between two wills in God, the voluntas beneplaciti, will of good pleasure, and voluntas signi, which is the revealed or preceptive will. Quote, "According to the former, applied effectively on the ground of God's special mercy to some, According to the latter, sufficient for all on the basis of his common love. That's on page 178. He affirms that Christ's death is universally sufficient and the gospel promise is universal in nature, even if not universally revealed. Quote, there are multitudes who cannot be saved because they cannot believe in Christ, unquote. That's on page 188. Davenant's key point: there is a general divine intention to save all conditioned on belief, but only the elect receive the infrustrable intention that actually brings about faith. Quote, the absolute and infrustrable intention of God concerning the gift of faith is special and limited to the elect alone, unquote. That's on page 191. Section 3, Pierre Du Moulin on the extent and efficacy of Christ's satisfaction. Du Moulin and the debate over hypothetical universalism. Often mischaracterized as a staunch Bayesian approach of hypothetical universalism, Pierre Du Moulin, in fact, held to a nuanced confessional view of Christ's sufficiency for all and efficiency for the elect. Vossius recognized Du Moulin as part of the broader Reformed consensus that included Calvin, Quimendonciu, and Pareus. Quote, the death of Christ is sufficient for the salvation of whoever believes, abundantly sufficient to save all human beings if all would believe, unquote, page 193. Du Moulin against the Arminians. Du Moulin's Atonement Arminianissimi, 1619, attacked Arminius' four-decree structure and his concept of a frustrated divine will. Du Moulin upheld the classic distinction between God's decretive and preceptive wills, but insisted that divine will is never thwarted. Quote, there are some things which God did not will and did not do, some things which he willed and did not do, but all that he has done, he has willed. Page 181. He argued Arminius' conditional election was not election at all. Quote, he proposes an election, that is Arminius, that is not election. God does not elect unless some are preferred over others. Page 199. From Arminius to Cameron to Amyraut, Du Moulin's perception in 1637. By 1637, Du Moulin was convinced that Amyraut's views followed Arminius and Cameron in spirit, if not in name. In his letter to the Synod of Alençon, he accused Amyraut and Testar of reviving the very errors the Synod of Dort had condemned. Quote, they teach that God has counsels and decrees that will never produce their effect, unquote. That's on 202. Geneva, Leiden, and Groningen theologians agreed with Du Moulin's concerns. The efficacy of Christ's death and universal grace. Du Moulin against Amyraut. Du Moulin strongly objected to Amyraut's speculative reordering of the decrees. Amyraut claimed God first willed to save all, conditioned on belief, and only later willed to elect some to faith. Du Moulin denied that faith could ever be the condition of a decree. It is a means. Quote, God does not will that someone live on condition that he breathes. God wills that someone breathe so that he may live, unquote. That's on page 207. I'll read that again. God does not will that someone live on condition that he breathes. God wills that someone breathe so that he may live. Du Moulin rejected any notion of frustrated divine counsel, universal grace, or salvific intention apart from election. Like Davenant, he denied that Christ's impetrated salvation for all. Quote, that Christ's death was sufficient for all did not imply that it had actually and intentionally accomplished salvation for all. Page 209. And in conclusions, Muller concludes that both Davenant and Du Moulin held to forms of hypothetical universalism that were 1. Confessionally reformed, 2. Non-Amyraldian, and 3. Careful to reject universal grace, conditional decrees, and frustrated divine intentions. While Amyraut introduced speculative changes to the structure of divine decrees Davenant and Du Moulin preserved the sufficiency-efficiency distinction. The sufficiency-efficiency distinction within a framework of definitive election. Quote, Du Moulin himself clearly advocated a form of hypothetical universalism. What he saw as problematic and dangerous in Amyraut's teaching was a speculative doctrine of the divine decrees, unquote. That's on page 215. Muller ends by warning against modern paradigms like Armstrong or Kendall that simplify the historical landscape into a Calvin versus Beza or Calvin versus Calvinists narrative. The truth, as it always is much more complex, and the tradition is much more diverse. And that gets us through chapter 5 of Calvin and the Reformed Tradition. Chapter 6 is on the golden chain and the causality of salvation, beginning of the Reformed Ordo Salutis. And then chapter 7, 8 follow. We'll catch you next time.